and welcome to the Bitlemmas podcast, episode 23. Today, I'm Watson, I'm here with B Sovereign, and today is a book review of Guild Socialism Restated by G.D.H. Cole. Guild socialism is industrial democracy with scoped authority. We don't want to copy medieval guilds in our review. We want to revive an old socialist label. The point is to ask where democratic authority belongs to production, consumption, and local life. The standard story says capitalism leaves workers governed by owners. So nationalize production under the democratic state. Or let producer organizations run their industries directly. Now, Cole refines that story. He has state socialism being a way to erase producer self government. He says that pure producer rule can erase consumers. Central coordination can quietly become command and control. Even workplace democracy needs leadership, discipline, appeal, and economic security. So, this episode is about the authority layer. Which institution is fit to decide which question, who else is affected, and what safeguard keeps coordination from being domination? So, what is this book about? It's a mature statement of Cole's guild socialist position. It's a theory of self government in production, consumption, and local life. It's a response to both state socialism and capitalist disorder. It's a blueprint used as a thought experiment. It's not really a medieval restoration. It's also a precursor to participation, self management, and workplace democracy. Now, what is the standard story that people normally would believe on the subject? The problem is that capitalism leaves workers governed by owners. The obvious fix is to nationalize production under the democratic state. Another fix would be to let producer organizations run their own industries. The hidden failure is each fix overclaims one standpoint. What Cole's problem is to it says is how to distribute authority without losing responsibility. So, what is his thesis? Guild socialism is industrial democracy with scoped authority. Democracy must reach the sites where people actually work and serve. Producer self-government is real, but not absolute. Consumer and territorial claims need their own representation, and coordination must remain service, not command. Now, we're going to talk about all of these terms that he's using. So, socialism, what he means by the state, producers, consumers, self government. We're going to get into all of these. Now, what are the major premises of the book? Passive consent is not enough for democratic life, and he's meaning passive consent in relation to your political participation. Political equality fails when industry remains hierarchical. Functions create special knowledge and special concern. We're going to see why that is important. And when he says function, he's talking about social functions. Consumers have legitimate claims on service, quality, and price. We'll talk about that. And local autonomy keeps institutions adaptive and human. And when he's saying there, what he's talking about there is a territorial view of democracy or the claims to democracy. Now, the four counterintuitive truths. Truth number one, democracy cannot stop at Parliament, or you could think of Congress. Truth number two, producer rule is incomplete without consumer safeguards. We're going to dig into that. Truth number three, decentralization needs institutions. What does he mean by that? We'll see. And then truth number four, coordination becomes actually dangerous when it turns into command. Now, truth number one, democracy cannot stop at Parliament. What does he mean? Cole treats democracy as active citizenship. What is active citizenship? That's when a person who's participating in active citizenship, they are participating in common activities that where they're directly affected, they're having some type of control over or input into the officers, the management, the policy, so on and so forth. So they're actively participating in things that directly affect them. A democratic principle applies to all social action. What does he mean by social action or social function? He's talking about your life as a producer, so work. He's talking about your life as a consumer. He's talking about your life where you place where your territory or where you live. So you have common interests for people where they live as well. These are all places that are social function, social action, or related to. Industry and economic life are not outside citizenship. So, in the literature of participatory democracy, one of the things that they really harp on is that in order to learn how to be democratic, the only thing that works is participating in democratic processes. One of the predictions within political science, and in this sense, we're really talking about the science part of political science and the empirical study of it, where empirically, when they test people, they are very apathetic within democracy. And the contemporary view is that political scientists actually like that. They believe people should just go and vote and then leave and be done. And they like the apathy. Why? Because the contemporary view of democracy is that when people get too active, they may end up voting for a strongman to take control when they because they're upset of by the way things are going. So they like apathy counterintuitively. Now, one of the pushback on that is the participatory literature, where people are saying, or where they say that in order to grow up and get used to democracy, you need to participate. And they've tried in different venues, in different places, to try to get people to participate in democracy. They tried at school, they measured at school, they measured at home, people communicating, educating, because the solution would be like, you just need to talk about what democracy is. And it's like, okay, no, but it does work at work. You do have some takeaways at work. What are the implications of people not participating in democracy? The other effect happens because when people believe that participating doesn't have any effect, then they become apathetic. So it is a feedback mechanism. That's why there is within the literature all of this, I guess, reasoning about and push towards trying to find places where people can participate, and it really ends up being economic life where you're spending 8 hours a day. So industry and economic life are not outside citizenship. That's a long way to say that, but that's the reasoning behind it. Voting for rulers is not the same as self-government. So this is the idea that you can't vote your way out of your problems because, of course, your representative government. So when he talks about passive, we'll talk about this, but passive democracy or passive consent, that's where you accept being represented in a system of governance that where you do not have practical power over the decision making process. Wage hierarchy, so someone defining your wage and you do not have a say, can empty political equality of substance. Plenty of things written about this, but I'll stop there.
So the intuition break here is that Cole really treats democracy as active citizenship and not simply a ballot. A citizen can vote and still be governed at work. A representative can misrepresent the purposes that a person is supposed to carry, multiplied beyond what one vote can express. So it's a claim that democratic principle must reach the associations that actually govern daily life. I can see this as the governance version of what episode 9 on thinking and systems had showed. If you don't change the structure, you haven't changed the behavior. So giving workers a ballot while leaving the workplace hierarchy intact is like changing the dashboard of a car without changing the engine. So the system produces the same outputs, but the leverage point is elsewhere.
All right, so now we have the democracy path. How does this work? First, you have a formal vote, and then people can realize that passive consent is not enough. We talked about passive consent. So you're accepting of being represented in a system of governance that doesn't allow you to have any practical power at all. Active citizenship. So you're an active citizen and you are participating where you have a common activity with others. All of you are directly affected and you're participating in the election of officers, managers, policy, so on and so forth. Then you can have industrial and economic affairs. So this is where you start to get more broad, and we'll dig into this more, but where it's industry wide. So let's say if you're a farmer, the ideas of best practices on farming, you could talk about that. So then you have self government through social action. This would be the direction or one way that this you can have a democracy that evolves.
Cole's point is that one representative can't carry every purpose. And I know we've stressed that. So, work, consumption, locality each need their own democratic surface. The builder translation for this is don't collapse all users into one user role. A person who is both a contributor and a consumer has different claims in each capacity. So, flattening them into one identity can hide conflicts, which is exactly what Cole is trying to make visible.
On this diagram here is exactly what B. Sovereign was just saying. There are many social purposes for people. So at the top, what do we mean by social purposes? You have your production, producers, your function as a worker. You could be a farmer. There's also your idea at your function as a consumer. So you buying things. There's also your social function in your territory, and there can be other ones. Those are common interest to the social function, and then they should be able to vote with others that are directly affected by those functions in some type of coalition. Now, you have one general representative for all of those social functions. That would be a misrepresentation. Somebody representing the producer side and the consumer side, that would be a problem. So the what Cole's advocated for is representation by function. You have distinct folks for the different concerns, and then you have who is in contact with the function. So contact with working in a factory, contact with buying meat. That's totally different things. The control, so control here would be what you want to sell the meat as, or what are best practices for farming practices with relation to meat, or purchasing. So consumer protection, these types of things. Now, what passive consent? What are the implications of the passive consent? A citizen can vote and still be governed at work. So this is talking about a workplace self-governing democracy. They're voting and being governed at work. The representative can misrepresent them at work and when there's purposes. So the person at work, they're a producer and a consumer, like we said. The economic hierarchy shapes education, status, and power. This is kind of you could call it perverse incentives of education and let's say even your representatives, your legislators, so on and so forth, and the outsized effect money has over that representation. So workers need positive power, not defensive prohibitions. What he's talking about here is you can think about unions and they have the ability to negotiate and create contracts. That would be a negative defensive power of a coalition of a group. Then you could have the positive power, which would be workers having some type of control over the production process. And when I say production process here, you can just think of there's inputs, there's risk, just like with capital. There's risks and there's actual labor. And then you have the work being done, and then you have outputs, which can be positive. So profit, of course, the actual widgets, but you can also have negative outputs like a failure, a loss, debt, all of that. All of that should be put in these arguments on the producer. So they're responsible for the positive and the negative. the target, and that's what, when we're talking about the production process, we're talking about all of that. So the target is self-expression through institutions. He's talking about workplace democracy would be the institution, and you could think of, he's writing in the 1920s. He's talking a lot about factories, but we're also talking about services, which were a minority then. They're a majority in the United States now.
So, and I did want to go back because I had a note here on the negative versus positive power. So the distinction here, right? Union prohibitions, especially during this time period, the employer was not able to fire without cause, and that is a negative power. So they constrain, right? Cole wants worker organizations to become positive powers, which is what we had stated, being more positive, being able to govern production and not just limiting their power. But the point that I wanted to drive home here for the builders is a complaint form is a negative power, but a governance role is the positive power. So the question is whether users can shape the system and not just appeal its outputs.
Now, truth number two, the producer rule needs consumer safeguards. This is one of the more counterintuitive truths, I would say. So, the workers have a special concern in their calling. Consumers have a common interest in vital services. Now, within Cole's view, you have the traditional capital view or maxim that entities or capital entities, corporations, and all this should be driven by profit. And then Cole says that actually there's another principle, which is the community itself. And when he's saying that workers have a special concern in their calling, you could say there's craftsmanship. Let's say you're a farmer, you want to create good crops and meat, but you also have a principle of serving the community. And then you have the consumers who are going to purchase or consume what you're creating. Now you can imagine, to think about this or reason about this a little bit more. You can think about the production of chicken. So if a farmer, they may be able to increase their profit by having their chicken grown within 24 days, lives in feces, and is blind. And then they sell that to you, and then they could make lots of money. That would be perfectly fine within the profit driven motive. You may not be able to find, because they could completely disinfect this chicken before it gets to you. You may not be able to find any short-term negatives of it. It also could have all types of hormones. It may take you 10, 20 years to figure out that something is wrong. So the market forces aren't strong enough in order for someone to stop from purchasing or to refrain from purchasing this and look low. So you can't, in the short term, so you can't rely on the market forces. That would be a controversial view, but if you're pro market can solve everything, but that's one stance. The consumer has a view. Their common interest is, I don't want to eat chicken that grew up in feces. It could be simply for humane reasons. It could be, I think it may not be healthy for me in 20 years or what have you. So now you have two sides with interest, producers and consumers. Now let's go to state socialism can deny producer self-government. You could say the state, and then now let's talk about what the state is. You could say the state is the monopoly on violence. So when we say government and we say state, I'm using that. His view is saying, okay, state socialism and the ways of negotiation, which is not even really negotiation, it's coercion, of the state can deny producer self-government. They can come in and say, you can't do the chicken that way. You also could have pure syndicalism. What does he mean by that? It's basically producers. So producers, you could think of guilds, only the producers. I say guilds, sorry, just producer guilds, people who are the farmers in this case. They can deny consumer representation. So they could say, well, too bad. You can, if you don't like our chicken, just don't buy it. But guild socialism, and in his way of reasoning about it, guild socialism includes consumer representation, participation, so on and so forth, tries to hold the functional. Remember, functional is social function, which is you can be a producer and a consumer. balance. So, yes, so this is really what truth number two is talking about.
So the insight here is that Cole refuses to pick a side. State socialism subordinates workers to a central authority. Syndicalism gives producers total control and makes consumers invisible. So Cole says the same person is a producer and a consumer, and they have different claims in each role. So the design move is to represent both standpoints institutionally, not a compromise, but a scoping. So producers govern the work, consumers get safeguards. If you hide one, the other overclaims.
Now we have this diagram on the producer consumer balance. You have the producer's special concerns. It could be pay, it could be what have you, profit. Internal control is held in trust. This idea of this held in trust is the principle of the community. So again, we're expecting the producer to be cognizant that they are also serving the community, not just profit. And so we reason with the producer saying, don't grow your chicken in feces. Do you eat it? Do you have some other chicken that you grow that you feed your family with that? Consumer safeguards, people can think of USDA and so on and so forth. Evidently, they're not that good at what they do, but having some, when you're not, when it's not in the guild socialism way, but you have these consumer safeguards that are supposed to protect against things like that. What do consumers care? A short list would be quality, like what I'm saying with the chicken, distribution, and price. Consumers can get together and negotiate price. You can think about this when there's a hurricane in Florida and you can have tree removal from homes. There can be a price gouging where people are normally they would charge 5,000, 10,000 to remove a tree, and they're charging 100,000 or 200,000 to remove a tree, which it's not just a aesthetic concern of the house, it's a safety concern also. So someone coming in, we normally now, in the United States, we rely on government to, I guess there's some discretion with governors that can come in and say, they can negotiate or stop this type of price gouging, this type of thing. But this view would allow the consumers to negotiate. It's outside of a coercion. Remember, the governor is coercive. It's outside of that. It could be that, well, if you do that now, we may not, we may get together and not purchase from you from now on. So we'll just kill you, basically, economically. And then that creates a functional democratic organization.
So, man, the chicken example is killing me. But Cole's point is that this isn't a class conflict. It's the same person making different claims in different roles. So the design challenge is making both claims visible at the same time. I could say after every book that we've reviewed up to this point that transparency is probably the best solution to most problems. And here is the representation surface is the governance surface. We saw this in episode 22. Again, linking to patterns of distributed systems, where the guarantee surface was the governance surface. So if you can see who has standing, you can see who governs.
So now our second diagram here. You have internal work decisions, again, democratic workplace. You have producer representation. Remember, you could have representation that is accurate or inaccurate. The public surface effects, we talked about what's the public surface. That's the principle that you ought to be internalizing as a producer, where you're serving the community. You aren't just trying to turn a profit. Then you have consumer and territorial checks. So the consumer checks, like we said, they're coming in and saying, we want you to, within your process, to farm your chicken this way, that way. And then also there's territorial. So this would be, you would have per territory, per place, per geolocation, this type of thing. They would have common concerns and they would be able to vote based off of that. Now the scoped authority and not total control that's where this idea of safeguards coming in for the consumer. So you don't want the consumer to be a micromanager on the producer. That's what people that are complete pro market solve everything. That's a problem. Is they, one way to look at it is the problem of nosy neighbors. People, you have no ability and you don't have any right to be trying to poke your nose in on these processes. He's try to address that with the scoped authority idea.
So the function boundary is the guardrail. Function defines the decision surface. Affected parties define the safeguards. So for builders, name the decision surface and name the affected parties. If a team can change an API contract unilaterally, that's total control. If users can review and object, that's scoped authority. So that is the difference between producer self government and producer capture.
All right. Now, truth number three: decentralization needs institutions. This may be also extremely counterintuitive. Cole isn't simply anti state, he wants responsibilities devolved and then authority divided. Producer associations need territorial associations beside them. So, this would be an example of just because you're a woodworker doesn't mean you have total authority over everything you do. Maybe, let's say you're a nuclear physicist and you make nuclear facilities. Well, if you want to make one in someone's neighborhood, there's going to be a territorial association and they're going to have something to say about it. Federal links make decentralization systemic. What does he mean here? His view is that the way to solve the centralization problem, or this march to command and control, is through bottom up democratic processes, institutions, so on and so forth. But there's a few, but one key capability or ability, I should say, for these institutions would be the ability to recall the delegate to a higher level. So what does he mean? So if you are a factory and you're creating furniture and you need to coordinate with other woodworkers or what have you. One solution, or the solution, is you can have an internal guild, district authority committee, or what have you. But you start having these best practices, like let's say you don't want to, cut down all of the trees too much for your carpentry. And so you all get together and say, let's all not, I want to say overgraze the field like with the cows, but let's not cut the trees. Well, you get together with this higher industry. Now, there's two ways. The higher industry that is over all woodworking carpentry could say, none of you can do this, and we have the authority to take away your license from doing any carpentry. Now, he says, no, we will send delegates up there and we can disobey you. We'll pull them away. And so the power stays at the bottom, and it's all about coordination. Higher tiers is about coordination. And this is how he's reasoning about the federal side. So this federal links. And then institutions keep the civic spirit from becoming a slogan. So really, again, this bottom up view is what keeps it being democratic instead of, oh, you have a president of the United States who just tells everybody what to do.
So the insight here is that anti-centralization a moat, anti-centralization alone is simply a moot. It's not actually like a full drawn out design plan. Cole separates himself from the completely radical anarchist because he wants institutions, not just dispersion. So without formal roles, decentralization becomes either chaos or a hidden return to central authority. You need the institutions to hold it in place. Cole revised decentralism, divides authority by function and place. So this is the governance analog of that we've seen in protocol. The structure is the protocol, which is episode 19. That decentralization without protocol is just noise.
Now he's writing in the 1920s, so he's talking about factories a lot. Factories, place of work, bottom layer. District guild committees, so factories coordinating with one another. Then national guild coordination. What is that? A national guild would be on the industry level. So woodworking, for instance, or farming. Then at that level, you also have the consumer and user bodies interacting with best practices at the national level. And then also you want to mix in the territorial associations.
And so, with this mapping, this again is harping on the fact that Cole doesn't just say decentralized. He had drawn a complete architecture, and each layer has a different claim. The links between them are what make it a system. So, for builders, the test is simple. If you can't draw the institutional diagram, you don't have decentralization, you have fragmentation.
Second diagram, going from the top down, you have a final centralized authority, which could be a monopoly on violence. Then the responsibilities devolve, separating into separate organizations. Historical ties strengthen, vertical authority divides. The horizontal would be you could have multiple workplaces within carpentry. And then vertical would be like vertical industries. You could have carpentry, farming, so on and so forth, where they have intermediate goods that go between each other, possibly, and they need to coordinate. And then, so the coercion, again, which the final centralized authority is on the top, the coercion recedes into rules. So universal rules, hopefully without discretionary power.
So the builder translation here is dissolving a choke point doesn't mean removing authority. It means distributing it so that no single node can capture the entire system. And we can link this again to the price framework that we reference a lot. No pre-mine, no roadmap, no issuer, and no censorship. So this would fall under the I, where no issuer means no single party controls the authority surface. But not sense rule means the rules are visible to all. So Cole wants both distributed authority and visible rules.
So, what does a guild look like? All workers by hand and brain in an industry of service. What does this mean? He's talking about hand would be blue collar workers, and brain would be service workers or white collar workers. Now, this is a borrowing the statement from the Fabians, which is a kind of, you could call a slow roll march towards socialism strategy, and a group that wanted to do that, but they also wanted to control government and monopoly on violence, that kind of thing. It was a control where you wanted to, again, under socialism, there was like a central planning and a slow way to march towards a central planning that was supposedly going to be lean or lend itself to the average worker more so. So public duty entrusted by the community. We talked about this. But if you are, a farmer of meat, you have a duty to grow that meat in such a way to where it is sanitary, so on and so forth. Internal autonomy over officers, methods, and arrangements. So we're talking about what a guild is. A guild with that is self-governing. This internal autonomy, this ability to vote, let's say, or have consensus over all of these things, officer methods, policy, so on and so forth. Flexible demarcation by service. We talked about the ability to work on or separate your division of labor. So you have people that are working on carpentry, so on and so forth. You can have that under one guild. And then coordination where the service genuinely requires it. So this is, the previous one is between multiple guilds. So coordination where service generally requires it is coordination between, let's say, workplace democratic or institutions. So you could call that a guild.
And this is really like the key distinction here between a guild versus a cartel. A cartel serves its members and a guild serves the community through its members. So the autonomy is there, but it's held in trust. So for builders, any self-governing unit needs both internal autonomy and external accountability boundary. Autonomy without accountability is capture, and accountability without autonomy is hierarchy.
All right, well said. Now, factory self-government. Again, 1920s is concerned with factories. You can apply it to services. A factory or workplace is a natural unit of guild life. Remember, he's preoccupied with bottom-up, democratic growing, and then we're going to talk about how his vision of how things grow a little bit later. It should be largely internally self-governing. It becomes the basis of a wider guild government. He's talking about his vision of how this thing would come to fruition. And it manages productive operations consistent with service. It can experiment with methods, styles, and products. So now, in this other book where he talks about the medieval guilds, one of the weaknesses that he would bring up is this idea of the medieval guilds being hostile to innovation. So basically, the idea that the cotton gin or some other new innovation, the guilds would say, okay, that's going to make it to where we can't employ as many people. We're going to lose jobs, or we're going to lose our apprentices. We're going to do all this. And so they would artificially, one, say we're not going to even use that tool. So they were really meticulous and pedantic on managing or allowing what tools could be used, which would be counterintuitive because one tool would actually be better. And they'd say use a worse one because of the outputs. And so they would use all types of different things. They would also artificially say, we don't want as many apprentices, so on and so forth. We can talk about that later. But this whole idea where he's saying, well, the guild should be allowed to experiment with the methods, styles, and products. He's trying to forestall or address the problem of innovation.
So the principle is push authority to the edge. The unit closest to the work should have the most autonomy. Higher layers should coordinate, not command. So if the factory has no autonomy, the guild becomes a new bureaucracy.
Now, truth number 4, coordination must not become command. Large scale service needs coordination. What would be an example of that? Railroads need coordination across a nation that's going to build all the railroads or railroad tracks. They need to coordinate on where they're going to meet up. They can't all be there. They could all be built by different organizations, but they need to crisscross. Coordination aligns supply, demand, materials, and external relations between guilds in this sense. But central power tends to routinize itself. So it sees a process, it says, oh, this process is efficient. I'm going to continue to do that same thing. And then it can become, like what it says, ossified. So too much central control produces bureaucracy, ossification. Again, central control and power, one of the highest duties that it finds for itself is to justify why it exists. So it never wants to yield or reduce the amount of authority it has. This is a problem with central control. The line between coordination and command is system risk, but system risk of what the whole idea of having a guild run society. So the idea is the higher levels or the tiers that are needed for coordination are just that. For coordination, you want to do things like being able to recall your delegates and so on and so forth. You don't want it to turn into a top-down command and control.
And that's exactly what my note here is. The question is not whether to coordinate, but how to keep coordination from becoming command. Coordination bodies accumulate power, and power routinizes. So for builders, this is the most live question in any federated system: is the coordinating body is always the one that becomes the choke point. So I mean, we've stated this in previous episodes, but it's necessary for coordination, but dangerous if it swallows the data nodes. This was specifically in the episode 22, consistent core.
On the coordination ladder, factory autonomy, district coordination between multiple self-governing factories, national guild coordination, like we said, that's going to be on the industry side. So we could say woodworking, inter-guild relations, and then which could be across industries. And then you want to have a guardrail, so service, not command. Of course, top down, trying to stop it from being federal where it's command and control. And then also you need to have a consumer side represented in there.
Yeah. So the rule is a design constraint. It's not a hope. The higher layer coordinates only if it does not swallow the lower layer. Each layer above must be narrower than the one below. So fewer decisions, less authority, more coordination. The builder translation: every layer needs a defined decision surface, and it must shrink as you go up. A coordinating body that makes operational decisions is not a coordinator. It is a boss, a commander.
Discipline becomes the accountable leadership. What is he talking about here? Cole doesn't pretend that democratic leadership is easy. Workers need experience and new habits of cooperation, like we were saying before earlier about how people grow into democratic participation. Leaders lose uncontrolled power of dismissal, dismissal meaning firing people. Peer trial and appeal replace arbitrary privation. So the ability to take away people's resources arbitrarily. Of course, hey, you no longer, if you're fired, you no longer can eat, this type of thing, but also within the entity. Saying you are now having all of your budget reallocated. Leadership becomes function rather than domination. Remember that function, he's talking about social function oftentimes.
The phrase that captures the shift is managers cease to think mainly in terms of power and think mainly in terms of function. So that's not necessarily a personality change, but an institutional one. When you can't fire someone arbitrarily, your relationship to authority changes. You have to persuade, coordinate, and justify. The Builder translation here is that governance isn't who has power, it's about what power can do without review. So this steps into scrutinizing every decision that's made. If you know that there's going to be blowback for your decision, or that you know that it's going to be reviewed by your peers, you're probably going to be a lot more careful about what you're doing.
So security changes the work relation. Economic security, again, you being precarious at your job, worried about being fired. Economic security prevents dismissal, being fired, from becoming social death. Public opinion inside the factory disciplines the leaders. They are concerned about the blowback. The manager is no longer the nominee of capital. So, again, people who are the owners now elect the directors, and the directors elect the CEO. Now, the person who is the manager is no longer elected by the people who are contributing the capital for the startup. Authority remains, but its legitimacy changes. The legitimacy is going to be tempered by that public opinion, like we said earlier. Work can become communal service rather than industrial imprisonment. And then when we say communal service, we're talking about that principle of you're not driven only by profit, you're driven by a community service. All right, National Guild, we're having this be the coordinator and not the boss. Like what we said before, the National Guild is mostly coordinating, not directly controlling, no command and control. It adjusts supply and demand. One of the arguments for, again, I mentioned this, but one of the arguments against the medieval guilds is that they were artificially adjusting supply and demand in order to min-max their returns. And so this idea of having a national, so industry-wide guild, again, having the consumers be a part of that, they could have a say and be able to at least put out there that this is unfair or what have you. It supplies raw materials and markets finished product and market finished products when needed. So that's I believe it's supposed to be in marketing, but it represents the guild externally. So this is a national guild talking about, you could have the Writers Guild like we have in Hollywood. You could have, again, woodworkers, what have you. The idea of the people within law that represent the bar. They represent law within a state or at a national level. And then they say this is what good law practices and this is what bad law practice. And they're representing. So it has to keep the central functions narrow enough to preserve autonomy. Again, he wants this bottom up and not top down. All right, inter-guild relations are the system test. Large industries can fit the guild model. Counterintuitively, people think that you can't have, when we're saying guild, remember we're saying self-governing organizations. So large industries can fit the self-governing model, but industries exchange intermediate services. So an example of that would be Mondragon in Spain. There's like 150,000 people in that, and they're self-governed. But industries exchange intermediate services constantly between, so you have intermediate goods. So whoever it is that creates nails, that could be the metalsmith guild or what have you, they're going to be transferring that those intermediate goods of nails that are going into the furniture. The carpentry guild or industry is going to be consuming that, and their output is going to be, sofas or what have you. Guilds must manage mutual traffic across production chains. Supply chains have to be managed. Banking and finance become part of the guild organization. So this is something that is surprising. Again, with the idea that there were banking guilds before. One of the problems with guilds ossification is between industries. So the banking guilds became into this outsized power, and it evolved into what we call capitalism now. And they were able to, even though they were small in number as far as people, they started having power to where they were able to manipulate the other guilds and make them subservient to them. The hard question is a system coordination without a state supremacy. So those banking guilds, they started having coalitions, of course, with the monarchs and, of course, the money printers, so on and so forth. So you have the evolution of that. And then so trying to make it to where you have system coordination without going to the group that has a monopoly on violence is going to be hard. All right, monopoly is a necessary evil. What does he mean here? Some services naturally require monopoly-like coordination. Coal, mine, railways, major services do not scale like craft shops. That's really the major premise here. But now, the labor monopoly may be necessary against capitalism. What is he saying there? So a national union, for instance, for the auto workers may be the only way that there's going to be any negotiation against a big company like a Ford or what have you. And so, in that view, that's where you're saying that's the only way that you may be able to have, for instance, your wages to increase with inflation, if that's a concern for you. But a monopoly spirited new order is unwise. So he doesn't like trying to go for monopolies and trying to make entities that are monopolies. So freedom requires room for independent and local forms. And then his strategy for how the bottom up self governing workplace democracies, how is it that they come into fruition and gain more power? So you have the negative union control. What is that again? The ability you get together at the workplace and then you can do things like negotiate with the strike threat. So that would be a negative view. Then this would be, and his idea is this is a policy of encroachment. The functions move from employers to workers. How? Because his strategy is for the workers to bit by bit take over the means of production, like saying we want to be able to control, because we know best, the assembly line, for instance. And then as they're doing each piece, he says that the workshop would get its power first, and then he envisions maybe across horizontally or vertically, you have some type of resolution that registers all of the accomplished facts. So people are saying you could look at Amazon factories, not factories, but warehouses. So once you had one in New York, there are three other ones. They were able to become unionized, and this is still at the negative union control. And then the next step would be, which I haven't really heard, but some type of positive control over those warehouses, and then being able to the registration or registering accomplished facts is people communicating, hey, warehouse workers, here's how you can go ahead and unionize and then try to take over the means of production. So now we have our portion of the book where we're critiquing the book itself. This portion here is based off of or trying to lean on software craftsmanship or best practices within software craftsmanship. This would be taking and lifting concepts from the structure and interpretation of computer programming. So that's primitives, methods of composition, and method of abstraction. It's also taking or leaning on some concepts from Christopher Alexander's book, The Timeless Way of Building. So he's critiquing. He also has a book called The Pattern Language. It's also where it critiques language and architecture and how you reason about and create a bottom-up architectures with facilitating people, creating their own buildings and structures and so on and so forth. Then you also have Eric Evans' book, The Domain Driven Design, where he's one of the takeaways from there is the ubiquitous language. Now, there is a domain language within this book about guild socialism. Some of the primitives are functions. So social functions, remember, your consumer, your producer, it's other things. Guilds, factories, consumers. You have fundamental methods of composition. How some of these can be combined. So some other primitives, how you combine them. Self-rule, self-organization, coordination, safeguards, consumer safeguards, and appeals process of leadership is doing. Combining all of those, and you start having something that is going to be a workable democratic process. Then you have fundamental methods of abstraction. These are the workhorses. You could call them meta compositions. And so scoped authority, like what we talked about before, active citizenship. These are going to be how you solve problems within the domain, accountable leadership. And then the ubiquitous language, you're naming things. So when you're talking about in this domain, you're trying to make it to where you don't talk past one another. So you name who is it that decides, who is served, who can appeal, or you may be naming the position of who decides. And so you don't talk past another person.
So this is the choke point to exit analysis. This slide pulls together the choke points that we've been circling all episode and how Cole routes around each one. The first choke point is final centralized authority over production. His exit pattern was to distribute authority into accountable associations. So when final authority over production sits in one place, the center doesn't just coordinate, it becomes the employer. Think of it like a parent who says that you can choose whatever you want, but has veto power over every choice. The kid has autonomy in theory, but the parent's authority is final. So that's what Cole sees in state socialism. The factory has self-government on paper, but the center holds final authority over everything produced. So the exit isn't abolishing authority, it's distributing it so no single standpoint can capture the system. The second choke point is employer power to dismiss without appeal. The exit pattern is peer trials, appeals, public opinion inside of the factory. Dismissal power is, I would say, the sharpest choke point within this list. If losing your job means losing everything, no vote or contract protects your voice. Think of it like a coach who can cut you from the team with no explanation whatsoever. You can practice hard, you can show up on time, you can play really well, be the best person out there, and still get cut because the coach didn't like your face. Cole doesn't take the coach's power away. He adds a review board. The coach still decides who plays, but if they cut someone, they have to show why. And a panel of peers can overturn it. That's what makes authority legitimate, and not who decides, but whether the decision survives scrutiny. The third choke point is the consumer claims hidden behind producer control. The exit pattern for him was consumer safeguards on service, quality, distribution, and price. So this is the syndicalism trap. If the people who make things run the whole show, the people who use what they make have no seat at the table. So think of it like the only pizza shop in town. The workers there know pizza. They should decide how it's made, what goes in the oven, how the kitchen runs. That's their autonomy. But the town eats there every single day. If the pizza makers decide to cut corners on ingredients, raise prices, or only serve their friends, the town has no recourse. They're not owners, they are not workers, they're simply customers. Just that. So in Cole's world, that's not enough. The function decides who's standing. Producers govern production, but consumers get institutional safeguards on quality, price, and access. And that boundary isn't necessarily a wall, but it's a jurisdiction. The fourth choke point is coordination bodies becoming command centers. And his exit pattern was narrow central functions preserve factory autonomy. So we can think of this like a homeowners association. I think that we kind of alluded to this earlier. It exists to coordinate shared walls, shared roofs, shared parking, and that is legitimate. But then let's say the HOA starts telling you what color curtains you can hang. That's the slide from coordination to command. Cole's guardrail is a boundary on what the coordinating body is even allowed to touch. It coordinates shared infrastructure. It doesn't govern your kitchen. The higher layer scope has to be narrower than the lower layers, or it will swallow it. And the final choke point is hidden authority in governance systems. His exit pattern was to make self government legible, the roles, scopes, appeals, and audit trails. So this really come about as transparency to everybody. This is the pattern behind every choke point in the slide. Authority that you can't see is authority you can't challenge. So think of it like the settings menu on your phone. There is a switch somewhere that controls whether your location gets tracked, but it's buried 4 levels deep, labeled something nobody would search for, and the default is on. That's not a choice. That's hidden authority wearing a user interface. So Cole's exit is to make self-government legible. The roles, scopes, appeals, audit trails visible in the happy path and not buried in some policy document buried somewhere.
Now, for builder usability, we want to make the self government, how the self government process is created and how it goes, how it moves forward, make it identifiable, legible. So, one idea is to view this onboarding. So, like, if you can imagine a system that you're building and you're trying to use this domain language of the guild socialism, the Rails community, so there's the framework called Ruby on Rails. They were very good at onboarding new people into the system, people who weren't even programmers, they were designers, so on and so forth. And some of their practices, they're really good with people who had didn't have a lot of experience, and then but at every touchstone, every step, they would have sane defaults is one thing. So make authority visible in a happy path. So one of the main premises of the author is about what we were just saying, the authority being hidden. We want to make that in the happy path. For if you're making a framework, you want to make it to where that the person implementing your framework can do the authority is easily automatically visible. Convention over configuration. This is the same defaults expressed even deeper. So default rows, scopes, appeals, and peer accountability trails. All of these things should have same defaults when someone uses your framework or system and they're trying to implement it within their community or what have you. Omakase, this is going into a restaurant and picking something off of the menu and not configuring it in any way, trusting what the chef has. So this is the idea of having strong opinions. You, as a framework creator for Guild Socialism, you're having strong opinions about this happy path. So your view for how work should be done. Of course, we're talking about self-organization and governance and all that stuff. You're going to make that very easy for them when you're making this framework. How they make decisions, you're going to have same defaults there, and you're going to make it to where hopefully it's really a one click and they're ready to go. Safeguards, we're talking about consumer safeguards there, and review. All of these things, you're wanting to make it to where you're creating a system within this domain. When someone implements it or instantiates it, it's all set up for them. Lean, minimum of viable product. When you are working on the system, again, what is it that someone will find value in that cares about this domain? So test where the users can name the decision owner, affected parties, and decision-making process. That is a high value thing for someone who cares about this domain now, that they want to see immediately. That reasoning about this when you're building it, you want them to be able to see that and know that because they already put value on that. And then worse is better. This idea of you don't want the great to be the enemy of the good, even though it is. What does that? You'll take forever implementing the great when you need to get something good out the door. So visible, imperfect governance beats hidden, benevolent command. Benevolent meaning good. They have good intentions, but it's hidden. No, Make it visible and imperfect. So now questions to contemplate. Where does your organization ask for passive consent instead of active voice? Are you promoting that? Which decisions belong nearest to the people doing the work? Which users or consumers need explicit safeguards? Where does coordination quietly become command? And what appeal path prevents one role from owning the whole system? Now, our conclusion. Guild socialism, restated, is a theory of active association. Its strongest move is scoped authority. It's not really a nostalgia. Producer autonomy and consumer safeguards belong together, and one of the builder lessons is to make authority visible before conflict.
So, yeah, to take us out here, here's the one model, one story, and one action for this episode. The one model is authority must be scoped and visible before conflict. Cole's deepest lesson is not that every project needs guilds, it's that authority must be legible. Users should see who can decide, who can object, what the safeguard is, and what happens on appeal. Hidden authority is not neutral, it's unaccountable power with a friendly interface. And the one story here is to think about a cooperative grocery store. The workers stock the shelves, they manage the inventory, and know the supply chain. They govern the internal operations, scheduling, methods, and product selection. But the neighborhood that buys the groceries has claims too on the quality, the price, and availability. If the workers can change prices without any consumer input, that's a producer monopoly. If an external board can override the workers' scheduling decisions, that's state supremacy. So the guild design says workers govern the internal operations in trust for the community, and consumers have institutional safeguards over service quality. The same people appear as workers and shoppers in different roles. Now translate this to a software platform. The contributors who build and run the service are the producers. The users who depend on the service are the consumers. If the platform team can change the API contract, deprecate features, or alter data handling unilaterally, that's producer monopoly. If users have no institutional voice, not just a feedback form, but a governance role, the authority is hidden. So the question Cole forces you to answer is, where is the governance surface and can users see it? Is it transparent? And the one action is to make your authority surface visible before conflict forces the question. For the sovereign curious, the next time you join a platform, a service, or a cooperative, ask one question: who decides what? And what can I do if I object? If the answer is a terms of service page, you have passive consent, not self government. Look for the decision owner, the affected parties, the safeguard, and the appeal path. If you can't find them, the authority is hidden. And hidden authority is the first sign of a choke point. So, for system builders, before you deploy any governance system, draw the institutional map. Name the decision surface for each role. Who decides what? Name the affected parties, who is impacted by each decision, and name the safeguards. What stops a decision from being unilateral? And also name the appeal path. What happens when someone objects? Put these in the interface, not in a policy document, because visible and perfect governance, as we said earlier, beats hidden benevolent command. Because visible governance can be contested and improved, while hidden governance can only be discovered when it fails.
Now, as always, leave any feedback in the comments section at bitlemmas.com. You can also visit bitlemmas.com for more information and past episodes, and we'll see you next time.